مرحبا.
أهلا، السلام عليكم دكتور قرقاش.
أهلا لك. Long time.
Long time.
Thank you
a
all.
Pleasure.
We can start.
It's a pleasure to host Dr. Gargash. He doesn't need any introduction. I just will say a couple of things that he and I met more than a quarter century ago when he was a young professor, and I was a young professor too at Cornell University, and we had a roundtable in the UAE. And I would say to this day, I remember the conversation, which was about how publics prioritize issues in the formation of policy, both in the Arab world and the US. Since then, of course, he's become a very key player in the UAE foreign policy at a time when there's been tremendous transformation in UAE foreign policy, particularly over the past more than a dozen years as Minister of State for Foreign Affairs. And so it's really a pleasure to have you, Dr. Gargash. And I will get right to it to ask some questions. So let me start with the big question of the day, sort of the Abraham Accords. And I will put it this way. Looking at the UAE, obviously the UAE is a sovereign state with its own national interests and has been advancing them as it sees fit. But the UAE is also an Arab nation, as its name suggests. It is also part of the Arab League, and it's also part of the Arab Peace Initiative that has in the past offered full peace for Israel with the Arab states in exchange for Israeli withdrawal from the Palestinian occupied territories. And obviously, the Abraham Accords did not make that a precondition, and it clearly went it alone, so to speak. So I want you to explore that a little bit, because obviously this was done with the opposition of the Palestinians, not only without essentially consulting them, but if you look back at other bilateral agreements of peace, there were two, the Egyptian and the Jordanian ones. When Egypt made its peace, obviously it paid a price in the Arab world, but it had fought 4 wars with Israel, and that was an end to a state of war that were devastating for Egypt, but also regained its occupied Sinai. That was very important in exchange for that deal that it got. And with Jordan, the Jordanian peace treaty really was done in coordination with the Palestinians right after the Oslo agreements, because it served both the Palestinian interests and Jordanians at the same time. So I'd like you to sort of, put this Abraham Accords agreement in perspective, given this background that I gave about how you weigh in Arab interests, Palestinian interests, if any, and the UAE national interests as the UAE defines them.
Thank you, Shibli. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity. And I think the main keyword here that I want to start with is perspective. So I want to put this, the Abrahamic Accords, within the perspective of how we see the region, how we see our role in the region. And, we've been going through an introspection about how we see the region, how we see our role, and how we see the sort of opportunities and challenges as we move to the future. And I think it's on 3 levels. I think this is also partly born out of the Yemen experience, partly is been shaped by the COVID challenge, a combination of things. I think on the first part, we see the coming period as a period where we prioritize diplomacy and de-escalation over any sort of kinetic engagement. Again, you have to see it within the context of a very difficult period that we have gone through. So again, as we move forward, it's not only the Abraham Accord. We have worked tirelessly, and it's taken us a long time to pull out of Yemen. We have been very much supportive of the Saudi effort to close the whole Qatar crisis chapter. I think since Berlin also, more and more in Libya, we have sort of been more and more involved politically and diplomatically, gradually and in an evolutionary manner. I think also vis-a-vis Iran, even with maximum pressure, we have sent a lot of public messages, a lot of messages through the Europeans about the need for diplomacy and de-escalation. And clearly the Abrahamic Accords are within that sort of perspective of moving forward and opening more avenues of looking at what seems like intractable issues and trying to think in a different and fresh way. I think the second component of our perspective is to build and be more competitive in terms of the UAE being a business hub and a logistical hub. And this is something that we will concentrate on very much in the coming period. So clearly, the relationship with Israel also has that dimension, a dimension of looking at a relationship, trying to understand that we can be more helpful on the political sphere, but at the same time to build also what I would call, practical opportunities in terms of where the UAE is positioned and where the UAE is open to business to all, and where the UAE can actually, sort of build partnerships here. And this is an important also part in our thinking of the Abrahamic Accords. The third element here is what I would call values and civilizational. And from this perspective, the UAE has been moving in an evolutionary manner to offer a counter-extremist narrative in the region. And I think for us, this has been, a journey. It's been a journey of about 30 years. And with Pope Francis's visit here, this was an important element of an evolutionary journey of saying the Arab world is not only about a political Islamist view of the region and a political Islamist view of Islam. The Arab world is also about moderation, and here is the counter view. And I think the numbers of Arab youth and the fact that, for example, 350,000 Palestinians live in the UAE is a testament to that people want the same thing. People want to bring their families in safety and security, to have opportunity, to be able to have good education, etc. So the Abrahamic Accords also fits in there. Now, that is the general perspective. Now, if we take the Accords per se, I think the Accords are, we believe that the two Arab countries that have been most helpful to the Palestinians are the two countries with the peace treaties with Israel. We feel that we can be more helpful. Let's talk about the political plane. Although the political plane is not the whole picture, we feel that we can actually be more helpful. And I think in our assessment also, because we've been thinking about this, we had to break this cycle. The idea that not talking to Israel, not building bridges for decades was not really yielding any results also. And the idea basically that if we can't yield results, we can actually differentiate between a good bilateral relationship with the State of Israel, but I think also, being steadfast in our support of a two-state solution and in the Palestinians' very legitimate right to have an independent state on the pre-67 borders. Now, part of this is that, but part of it is also about values and civilizational. We feel that we have to build these bridges. We have to do it because the idea of a cycle of hate and a cycle of violence has not really resolved the issue. Again, I have to say that and say that the UAE would like to play an important assisting role in achieving a two-state solution, in supporting and helping the Palestinians. We recognize that we are not perhaps one of the main players here compared to countries that have borders with Israel, etc. But we feel also that the Israelis have an opportunity here, a strategic opportunity, to show them the fruits of peace through a relationship that is very much unlike other treaties of peace that they have signed.
Well, let me push you a little bit on that, Doctor. So, in one regard, obviously, you think it could be helpful to the Palestinians. Certainly, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians don't think so, both the authority and the public, right? They've opposed it. But beyond that, you could see how it's used in the Israeli debate, where the right-wingers, and including a prime minister of Israel, say, we told you we can make peace without concessions. Here we are making peace with the Arab countries without having to make any significant concessions on the Palestinians who've been under occupation for over 50 years. And so that's obviously it's in a way it has, whether intended or not, it has played into the hands of the right-wingers in Israel who gained the upper hand. And beyond that, there were reports in the Israeli press of the UAE also doing business with settlements that are illegal under international law. And how do you, maybe these reports are inaccurate. There were many of them, not just one. But how do you see that? How do you respond to those kind of arguments?
Again, Shibli, the Palestinians were also unhappy with Sadat's deal for many, many years. It took time for them to recognize that Egypt's peace with Israel would also bring, as much as it would bring challenges to the status quo then, it will also bring opportunities. I grant you that a majority of the Palestinians are not happy, that they see that this weakens their position. But I think at the same time, looking back in terms of the history of what we have seen before, we can see that this is a question of perception. If you see it as an opportunity, we can help and we will help. So I think that is an important part. As far as the Israeli and you're justifying, for example, the Israelis' right position and so on and so forth, I think, as you know, in the Middle East, you can never pick your moment. Here again, what triggered the deal was, why did it happen now? What triggered it, as you know, was this deal to freeze the settlements. And for us, that was really the trigger that brought forward our diplomatic relations with Israel to 2020, something that could have happened in 2023 or 2024, for example. So for us, that was the right opportunity. Vis-a-vis the issue of settlement products, etc. Anytime you build a relationship from scratch, there will be many cracks that you need to organize, you need to address. And I think this has been the case in terms of visas. This has been the case in terms of doing many, many things, because you really start from scratch. And I think the UAE has a firm position politically that is part and parcel of an Arab position supporting a two-state solution. I think in the coming period, the UAE will be able to help more and more, because you will build more of a circle of trust with the Israelis. You're not going to change fundamentally their thinking, but I think building a circle of trust does help. And I feel that we will actually add value. But as I said, the deal is not only about politics. It's also about values. It's also about economics.
Yeah, with regard, just quickly, I'm going to move to the other big issue, which is Iran, which obviously the UAE has so much stake in that issue. But I just want to note here on the freeze that it was a temporary freeze, that of course there were a lot of others pressuring Israel not to freeze, including Democrats who are on the verge of winning the presidency. And that in some ways, that freeze is important, of course. But at the same time, obviously, it doesn't explain the dealing with settlers who are considered to be illegal under international law. It's something that has to be further discussed, obviously. But let me turn to the really, one can argue, the most immediate issue, which is policy toward Iran, because that obviously is the one, since we're talking about the Biden administration, that's the one it's going to have to make a decision on pretty quickly, whether or not to go to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, or whether to negotiate further. And I want to ask you this question in a little broader than should the U.S. go back or not go back without renegotiation. That's an issue that I will certainly ask, but I want to put it in a little bit of perspective because you as the UAE have a lot at stake, and arguably more than anyone else, given your history of contention with Iran over territory as well. When you look at the origins of the Iran nuclear deal under the Obama administration, it was obvious that you were not in favor of the deal as it was being negotiated, and neither were the Saudis, and certainly the Israelis opposed it. But ultimately, when the deal was made, you and the Saudis publicly supported it. The Israelis did not. And I'm wondering, at that time, Israel took the lead in fighting the deal in the U.S. In a way that alienated a lot of Democrats, as you know. Benjamin Netanyahu came and spoke to a joint session of Congress on this issue. But you and the Israelis have a lot in common in wanting to limit Iranian influence, undoubtedly. That's a common interest, and that clearly possibly is one of the driving forces. But do you really have identical interests? I mean, if you look back at the inception of the deal and now, the Israelis focus principally on the Iranian nuclear facilities. Not the only one, they care about the conventional issue as well. But they made the Iran nuclear issue as an existential issue to them, which is one reason why the Obama administration made that issue a top priority, because it didn't want to be dragged into a war it didn't want with Iran. And now we face a similar situation where obviously the nuclear issue is at the core. But for you, not just the UAE, but Gulf Arab governments, you have much more than the nuclear issue. Conventional weapons of Iran, meddling in and influence and reach in the region. All of those things matter more than your nuclear issue to you. So is there a little tension in the prioritizing between you and the Israelis on what should be done as you're talking to the Biden administration? Did you learn any lesson from the 1990s when the time when from 2015 that you can now kind of expand to the relationship with Biden?
I think the first thing, Shibli, I want to say is that the Biden administration strategically is doing the right thing. Okay, and the right thing here is diplomacy. There is no other option. Looking at where we are with a few kilometers to our neighbor to the north, and as Dina Qawar said in the session before this, Iran's not going to go away. We're not going to go away. So I think strategically, the Biden administration is doing the right thing in terms of prioritizing diplomacy. I think that's the first thing that we say. Then we really go into other issues. So the other issues are we concerned about missiles? Are we concerned about proxy politics? Yes, we are. And we need these to be taken into account. So that is really our concern. Our view is adamant and very clear, even with maximum pressure of President Trump's administration. We had sent many signals directly to the Americans, to the Europeans, about the need for de-escalation. We were very supportive when there was no retaliatory action by the president against the shot-down drone, and so on and so forth. So clearly, I think the issue right now, from our perspective, is not about the strategic trajectory. Our concern is about the traditional things that we've been saying. There has to be a regional voice. We have to take into account, the concern about the missile technology that the Iranians have. And as Tom Friedman said in an article a few months ago, that following the attack on Aramco, we really need to look at these with fresh eye. It is important, in my assessment, to get a process going. The idea basically is not only to find a fast solution, the idea is to find a permanent solution. And to find a permanent solution, number one, you need to prioritize diplomacy. Number two, you need to de-escalate. Number three, you need also to listen to the concerns of your neighbors. and your friends in the region, us and others. And I think here also locking Iran in a process, and the process should not only be about the stability of the region, it should be also about the prosperity, because Iran also needs to be part of a zone not only of prosperity, stability, it has to also be in a zone of prosperity. Now, having said that, do I see that immediately? No. Unfortunately, it'll take time to move from where you are and build confidence and do this and that. So clearly, as you may suspect, we are keenly following all this. We like what we see strategically, and we are pushing really not at the strategic level, but at the detail level. So at the detail level, we want the regional voices to be heard, to be part of some process. We also want to sort of have a fresh look with regards to missile technology, etc. I mean, if you look at us, our trade with Iran has dropped from $18 billion to $3 billion. So it's not only political, but it is also in terms of our own goals, etc. If you look at us also, we see our security very much enmeshed with the Arab world security, especially with Saudi Arabia. And from that perspective, we are, of course, concerned every time that Saudi Arabia is targeted. So all these issues are important to address, either in a stage 1 or a stage 2, because what we want is, rather than a quick deal, what we want is a permanent deal.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful. But in terms of real options open to the administration, as you know, there's a debate on whether to reopen the deal and negotiate some of those issues, including ballistic missiles, before you return to the JCPOA, or whether to return and then have a negotiation on all these issues. And maybe there's some things in between. But clearly, the instinct of the president, at least as expressed in the campaign, and his advisors, was to return, because it was the U.S. who unilaterally withdrew from the accord when President Trump pulled out of that accord. And that's really arguably the immediate question, because there is a sense that if the U.S. doesn't do that very quickly, it's going to drag on, and in essence, misses that opportunity. In fact, there was an article just in the past couple of days saying that the opportunity may have already passed to return to the JCPOA as it exists. So if the administration decides to go back to the deal as it exists quickly, but also open an ongoing negotiation with Iran and allies in the Middle East, including the UAE, to address some of those other issues that are of concern to you, would you be supportive of that?
Shibli, I know the arguments. I've been talking to the Europeans for 4 years now, so I know the argument. I think I would say, yes, we will be supportive of it. We will be supportive of it, but what we want to really know is, are the other issues going to be addressed? And in my opinion, there are, 3 issues here, other than the nuclear issue. One of them is the regional voice. What are the concerns of the region? I think the second one is, the regional politics of Iran. But I would say that beyond that, we really need to think, Shibli, about how do we reconstruct the region. The region can't go from crisis to crisis to crisis. I know that these are long-term concerns, but we are really thinking of a region for our children and their children. We're not just thinking of the now. And I think from that perspective, this is essential and important. I think if there is that sort of direction, we will back our biggest strategic ally, the United States, in what it sees as a priority. As long as I said, we are very much supportive of the diplomacy of it, because, we live in a neighborhood that we have an interest that issues, no matter how they seem intractable, need to be resolved diplomatically.
And I think that as you know, you have a lot of people who agree with you in the Biden administration, the U.S. Meaning, I don't think the question is whether the administration sees Iranian behavior not to be problematic beyond the nuclear issue. As you know, they do. That's not the issue. It's a question of how you deal with it diplomatically, and that's interesting. It sounds like the gap is narrower than it might appear between you and the Biden administration. But one point, just a couple of days ago here on this forum, a major candidate for leadership in Israel spoke, and he said that Israel should consider a military option against Iran, even without approval from the US. What do you think of that in terms of consequences for the UAE?
I think that's very dangerous talk, to be honest. That's very dangerous talk. And I think this is why it is important for all regional voices, not only Arab voices, but also for the Israelis to be involved. Because as I said, we should not only think of the immediate, although the immediate takes priority, but we really should think about building forward. I understand the concerns, but again, from where we sit here in the Gulf, and from a region that's been scarred by too many conflicts, other than diplomacy, we just see no option at all.
Yeah. So let me turn to a broader question, and really a question that you should be especially familiar with because it happened, during your period as Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, and that is the expansion of the UAE's regional influence and reach, including military, political, military, economic. Essentially, the UAE became a major player in regional affairs. And that includes, obviously, involvement in the Yemen war and involvement in the Libya civil war. And so I want you to, give us a little bit of a picture as to what drove this expansion over the past decade of the UAE's role in especially in places like Yemen and Libya, but also in a way projecting ahead in the next decade. Do you see that role diminishing or growing, especially on the military dimension?
Well, I would say three things, Shibli. Three things. Number one, our role in Afghanistan was driven very much by burden sharing. Our role in Kosovo was very much in the stabilization of Kosovo was very much driven by burden sharing. Our contribution to the NATO operation in Libya was very much driven by burden sharing. These are roles that we played because we recognized that in our relationship with the United States and other friends, it's not a one-way street. You have to add value in order to expect also commitment to your own security. I think that is one side of our expanded role, and you see it in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, there's a famous story by Sheikh Zayed speaking to Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, where basically it was important to have an Arab Muslim country in the anti-Bin Laden, anti-Taliban coalition. Otherwise, this would have looked like a crusade. And our role was essential. We had 1,000 troops every single day for 11 years. So this was more of a burden sharing, a burden sharing role with our major ally. I think the second thing is we also played a very active role in counterterrorism. So our role in ISIS, our role in Somalia, and of course in Afghanistan, and initially also in Libya, was very much also driven by what we feel is still a global fight against extremism and terrorism. So this was also part of the driver here. And the third role, I think, that you see in Yemen was by a feeling of helplessness in the Arab world, of seeing regional countries interfering unimpeded in Arab affairs, and suddenly hearing that Sana'a will be the 4th or 5th Arab capital that had fallen to Iranian influence. So it was more of also part of the UAE's policy to try and sort of build or help build an Arab core here. But we've done this all, Shibli, without much hubris. In a sense, we've always been a partner. We never moved anywhere alone. If you look at where we have been, we've always been a very, I would say, useful partner, whether it was in Kosovo or Afghanistan or Libya or other places. Again, with lessons learned, with COVID, with our sort of perspective for the future, we see the challenges that are different in the coming period. And I think this is why, as I mentioned, there was an opportunity to describe to you our perspective.
The burden sharing certainly was a dimension early in Libya in joining the NATO effort, but certainly it took an independent. I mean, the UAE then pursued its own independent role in Libya that was decidedly not in harmony with NATO policy. So obviously, your strategic interests have evolved.
You have an issue of legacy, of course. You have an issue also at that time of a real concern about a terrorist challenge facing Egypt in Sinai, and a terrorist challenge facing Egypt also on its western border. And for us also at that time, it was essential to help Egypt, again, from the same sort of perspective of an Arab core.
Okay, so let me move to two other questions that are related. One is your relationship with your sister Saudi Arabia. It's been a close relationship, obviously, over the years. You've cooperated a lot, including in places like Yemen, but there was also tension. You didn't see eye to eye reportedly on Yemen. Maybe you can enlighten us on that. The approach to Islamist groups in the region has not been identical in terms of, at least apparently, and certainly that's what people who follow this say. So I want you, first of all, to tell us how you interpret that relationship, how you see it, points of agreements or disagreements. And tied to that, I'd like you to perhaps reflect on an article that just came out a couple of days ago by Senator Chris Murphy in Foreign Affairs, in which he basically says, look, our interests in the Gulf region are not as they used to be. They're still important, but not as important as they used to be. And we certainly don't need to have a big military footprint in the region to address those interests. So I'd like to have you tie these two together, perhaps in the way you and Saudi Arabia see it.
Well, Shibli, again, I mean, we are not a major Arab country in terms of size. So part and parcel of how we see our region and how we see our world is we see ourselves as part of an Arab team. And the Arab team, no Arab team can be core and influential unless you have the Egyptians and the Saudis there. And then you add us on and you add others on. So for us, we see the sort of Arab order, and we see our security very much also connected to stability and prosperity in core Arab countries such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and hopefully in the future, countries like Iraq and Syria again. We see that as an important perspective. Again, any relationship will be tested by 2, 3, 4 years of war. And I think, we've done quite well in managing that relationship through very difficult time. I would say many of the reports were exaggerated. Some of the reports were very politically motivated. But I would say overall, the relationship was very much tested. But as we speak today, as we are out of Yemen, we don't really have a Yemen lead. We see a Yemen lead by countries like Saudi Arabia. We see a Yemen lead by the UN. We see a Yemen lead by the government of Yemen, and we support that. But we don't really have, our own sort of independent Yemen policy. Now, on the Chris Murphy article, I saw that. But, you look at our relationship with the United States. During the Carter era, that relationship was much about defense and about energy. Our relationship with the United States has also evolved. It's no longer only about defense and about energy. We're doing about $26 billion of trade with the United States. That's only the UAE. We've got different partnerships in the cultural sphere. We're working with the Gates Foundation on polio eradication. We've got 60, 70,000 Americans living in the UAE. It's a more well-rounded relationship. You've got one of the best hospitals in the Arab world today in the Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi today. I don't, as the region is shifted and as the dependence on energy of the region is shifted, we have to be cognizant of that. But I would also come and say that there are also different areas that compensate for that, perhaps not fully, but this is no longer just an oil and security relationship. This is also a relationship about values. It's a relationship about economics. It's a relationship about culture and so on and so forth. And these are areas that make the UAE what it is today as a business hub in the region. So I see all that as an evolving thing. We've got to really have our eyes on the ball here. On the one hand, what Chris Murphy described, and see how much America will be committed to the region. And I have to just remind you that this is an ongoing debate for the last decade. And, it takes a new sort of dimension, and it's an important one. But on the other hand, also, I think as we become more and more global partners. I mean, the things that we are doing today in terms of changes in our governance, changes in our legal structure, is further making the UAE, rather than just being a regional center, is aspiring to be even more than that. And if we aspire to be more than that, it will make us perhaps more of a partner, not for the traditional reasons of security and energy, but for other reasons that are shaping our world today.
Hey, one related question about your relationship with Qatar. Obviously, that's the other big issue in GCC relations. And recently, you have restarted dialogue with the Qataris and essentially ended the blockade on Qatar. So could you tell us a little bit more about A, what drove that, and B, where the bilateral relationship between the UAE and Qatar are? I know there was a recent meeting related to advancing bilateral relations.
Well, let me just say that the meeting was very good. It was very positive, very constructive, and I'm sure that the Qataris will be delighted with it as much as we will be delighted with it. Again, I think much of the normal interaction is returned, but we will still have some, I would say, issues that are born out of mutual, confidence building and so on and so forth. These will take some time. Again, I think this is part and parcel of our sort of introspection, of thinking of the region, thinking of our place in the region, and thinking also of how we move forward. And then, of course, the idea was the Saudis would take the lead in resolving the issue with Qatar, and we really were happy with anything they arrive at, because we wanted to just close that chapter and get on with what we see as different challenges for the reasons that I mentioned. The Yemen war, the sort of necessity really to work more on a diplomatic front with Iran and other countries in the region, and of course the COVID also, the COVID crisis that has really engulfed the whole world. I mean, we would be deaf not to listen to all these things, so to speak. And I think at the end of the day, when the Saudis started on behalf of the four countries to negotiate with Qatar, we were really happy with any solution, because it was really about turning the page here. And I think, we're on the right track.
Yeah, let me just turn to a question that directly relates to the Biden administration policy. Throughout our conversation, you mentioned the issues of values. As you know, the Biden administration has made very clear that it's going to prioritize issues of democracy and human rights. They've mentioned them already in multiple conversations that they've had with leaders of the region, both at the level of the president and at the level of the Secretary of State. And the UAE has been criticized by many human rights organizations on multiple issues, especially treatment of migrant workers. How do you see that playing in the relationship with an administration that is going to be focused very much on issues of human rights?
Well, we started a strategic dialogue with the United States. We announced it, I think it was in October, and it was the UAE that insisted that we should have a human rights pillar as part of that strategic dialogue. I think here our record is very strong, Shibli. Of course, there will be a few cases, a few areas, either of concern for many NGOs or areas that we need to work harder at. And I think we're very open towards these areas. I don't really see this as an intractable challenge. I think if you see what we have done with migrant workers over the last decade, I think our records speak for itself. There is huge improvement, but there's still a lot of work to do. If you look at, for example, what we have done also on women enablement in the UAE, where 66% of our federal workforce is women, for example. 80% of our Mars probe team was women, for example. We've done a lot of good work here, but you do have, of course, because of human rights being an emotive issue, you do have that 1 or 2 or 3 cases where there is a lot of what I would call lobbying and strong feelings about. And I think these are difficult cases, but I'm very confident that the UAE will be able to address. And I think anybody who engages with us will recognize many of the things that we've done. I mean, if you just look at our recent changes in the laws on cohabitation, on foreign nationalities being able to basically govern their lives with their own legal codes in terms of divorces, in terms of wills and so on and so forth. There's a whole can-do attitude. I have to say that there are some thorny issues. I have to say that there are issues where culturally it is very difficult for the UAE to address. But I think when it comes to the issue of cultural exclusivism, we are more and more leaning towards universality and towards a global acceptance of what the norms are. I mean, this is not an easy issue, but this is an issue.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy issue, and it would take more. I would have far more questions on it, except we're running out of time. I want to squeeze in one question from an audience because it was mentioned by 2 people about the COVID-19 and how you have dealt with it. Obviously, you have a lot of resources and you have small population, but also do you see it as your responsibility to use some of those resources to address the regional COVID-19 issue?
And we have. I think the first thing we've done is we've never shut down the economy. And I think this is, we are such at the heart of logistical things. So we've taken measures, but we have never shut down the economy. We've put in measures. We haven't really gone into policies of lockdowns, but put measures in place. Today, we've got several challenges. I think on the bright side, we are today at 5.9 million vaccinated. We're at 59% of the population vaccinated. We're second to Israel there. So we're doing very well there. We have about 1,100 plus deaths. So the numbers are, but we have a lot of pressure on our medical infrastructure. But I think also what we have done is we have sent support that has benefited about 1,900,000 frontline workers in 100 and something countries. And these have been, Hansard suits and equipment and things like that. And of course, we've also sent recently, for example, 20,000 vaccines to Gaza, and we've sent vaccines to Egypt. But then again, we, like everywhere in the world, we have some shortage in supply in vaccine. So what we have really tried to do is run a very efficient, organized campaign. And I think we have done a very good job there, but also tried to keep as much of the economy open and humming as much as we can. And I think this has been appreciated by all, because the economic impact also of the health crisis can be as devastating as the health crisis itself. And at the same time, this huge push, we are doing about 100,000 vaccinations a day. That is what we are doing right now. And of course, we are also trying to send help to many of these countries. So we've tried to balance basically about our national priority and regional responsibility.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you joining us, taking the time. It's been a very good conversation. I really appreciate your frankness, and it's good to see you again after so many years. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.